Committee. Yesterday, Ranking Committee member Mark Warner reiterated that he has even more questions after the staff of the committee spoke to Jared Kushner this week. Without mentioning any specifics, obviously, we don't want to get into anything you can't share with us. Is there something striking from the interview? Anything that raises more questions?
Senator Warner is right to say there are a lot of key questions ahead. For example, in his public statement, Mr. Kushner said that he didn't rely on the Russians to finance his business. Now, I'm telling you, Jake, that's some awful careful lawyering to put together a phrase like that, because rely is subjective. Mr. Kushner didn't say that he has had no business investments with Russia. He didn't say he has no dealings with Russia. He said he didn't rely on it. So there was a lot of clever lawyering, and it seems to me the combination of Jared Kushner's public statement and the fact that the president has said several times that Mr. Mueller has no franchise in order to look at his finances indicates to me today that the Trump family is very concerned about the follow the money issue. That's what I've zeroed in on.
And one of the things that Senator Warner, with whom you work on the Intelligence Committee, said on my show, State of the Union, a few weeks ago, was that the Trumps, whether it's the father, the president, or Eric or Don Jr., they're always very careful when they talk about Russian investments. They talk about how they don't have any money in Russia, but they never talk about how Russians might not have money in Trump industries, Trump properties.
Let me give you another example. This is the first president who hasn't been willing to release his taxes in 40 years. I've introduced legislation to change that. If you had those taxes released, for example, you could find out about some issues that may relate to borrowing money. That's why the public's got a right to have this information.
But what might this have to do with anything?
Well, certainly, if you look at the fact that in 2008, the Trump family said much of our portfolio involves Russian investment.
Right, Don Jr. said that.
Don Jr. said that was a tough time to get money, and the president hasn't disclosed his taxes, and we're looking at a tax reform bill that might benefit the Trump family. We have got to get at those issues.
But would that have anything necessarily to do with the investigation into possible collusion, or is this just interesting and...
Well, I'll just tell you point blank. Don Jr.'s meeting, the one that took place in the summer 2016, clearly was an attempt to collude. If you look at those emails, if you look at his own admissions, I don't think you can conclude otherwise.
All right, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, thank you so much. Appreciate your time, sir. Bracing for the worst as the death toll keeps rising, families of U.S. Embassy employees being told to leave Venezuela as tensions rise ahead of a controversial vote. Stay with us. The Russian government announced this morning that it is seizing U.S. properties there and ordering a number of American diplomats out of the country. Russian officials say this is a response to new sanctions overwhelmingly passed by the Senate last night and the House earlier this week. It's unclear whether President Trump, whose White House has been under the cloud of the FBI investigation into possible collusion between the Russian government and his campaign, whether President Trump will exercise his very first veto against these sanctions. But it appears lawmakers have enough votes to override any veto either way. Let's get right to CNN Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto. And Jim, what exactly did the Russians tell the U.S. Embassy?
They told in very strong terms the following. They said that this measure is further proof of the United States' extremely hostile foreign policy, hiding behind its sense of superiority. The United States arrogantly ignores the stances and interests of other countries. So quite strong in diplomatic terms there. They also took two measures similar to what the U.S. did during the transition in response to Russian interference in the election. They're booting a number of U.S. diplomats from Russia, bringing the total number down to 455, which is the same number of Russian diplomats in the U.S. These things tend to be reciprocal. And they're also blocking access to two diplomatic sites in Russia that U.S. diplomats there use, similar, as you may remember, to what the U.S. did, seizing those two compounds. This is a little different. One of them is a place along the Moscow River where diplomats like to barbecue and walk their dogs. But, you know, in a post to go overseas, this kind of stuff is important to those folks, and the Russians now taking them away.
And how is the Trump administration responding to what Russia announced?
The fact is they can't do a lot. I mean, they're giving a strongly worded statement, as you might expect. This from the U.S. ambassador to Russia. We have received the Russian government notification. Ambassador Taft expressed his strong disappointment and protest there. So that's really all they can do. But I think, you know, as you look at these diplomatic steps, that's one thing. In effect, it's the Russian response to what the U.S. did during the transition. It's the other areas that might be more consequential. If Russia was looking to, for instance, be more cooperative in Ukraine, less aggressive, that kind of restraint, if you want to call it restraint, less likely now as relations continue to deteriorate.
All right, Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. It's been a long week here in Washington. I can't believe it's only been a week. Let's dive right in with my panel. And Senator Santorum, I'm going to start with you, even though we're going to be talking about the interview that my friend Ryan Lizard, right to my left, just did. What did you make of the interview that Anthony Scaramucci did? You don't have to get into the language, but the sentiments expressed about firing the whole White House Communications Department, his comments about Reince Priebus, his comments about Steve Bannon, his comments about digital fingerprints. What did you think of it all?
Unhinged. It's just not exactly what the White House needs right now. It's not what this president needs. I mean, he's got some very serious things he's working on. He's trying to get a health care bill. He's trying to revive a health care bill. He's got a tax bill he wants. I mean, there's all sorts of things. Obviously, you got nuclear problems, and you have this complete distraction out of left field of someone who does not improve the public perception of what's going on at the White House.
And Ryan, let me ask you, because an ethics group in Washington has written a letter to the Inspector General of the Justice Department asking him to investigate, quote, inappropriate contact between Anthony Scaramucci, the new White House Communications Director, and the Department of Justice. That is in response to what one of the many, many things that Scaramucci told you that was notable and quotable. This one, quote, "I've got digital fingerprints on everything they've done," meaning White House staff, "through the FBI and the bleeping," he didn't say bleeping, Department of Justice. When he said this, obviously there's a lot of New York bravado in Mr. Scaramucci's comments, but did you think it was legit when he said it?
I frankly have my doubts, you know. There was a lot of just sort of bluster, I thought, you know. He did, and if you look very carefully, he told me that he'd already contacted the FBI, but then when he tweeted right after the interview, he actually tweeted that he was going to contact the FBI. So there's a discrepancy there. So I really wonder if he did contact the FBI. He obviously said he did, and he repeatedly said that he believed that Reince Priebus committed felonies that needed to be investigated by the FBI. His evidence for that, frankly, was very, very thin. But that was the first, after I got off the phone with him, that was the thing that jumped out at me is, my God, I've never heard a White House staffer tell a reporter that he's going to call the FBI over a turf war inside the White House. So maybe it was bluster, maybe it's something more serious. It certainly seems like it's something worth asking some more questions about, especially when he was talking about digital fingerprints and the like. He made it sound like he was, you know, he had the place wired or something to root out the leakers. Yeah, that's about it.
Very bizarre. Anita, you've worked in White House where Rahm Emanuel was, I believe, and so you've heard some tough language. You've heard some salty language. Although I
don't think Ryan ever heard that.
No. Oh, yeah. Oh, I've quoted Rahm dropping multiple F-bombs many times.
Yeah.
But what did you make of this?
Well, I thought there were a couple of things that were just extraordinary about his interview, Ryan's interview with Mr. Scaramucci, who, let us remember, has been in office now 1 week.
1 week,
and quite an auspicious start it is. The first thing is that he actually was calling the FBI about a document that is a public document. And he likes to cite his Harvard law background. Perhaps he missed the week on public disclosure. But, you know, financial disclosure documents are public documents that senior people in the government have to file. So the second thing that really struck me, though, was he was complaining to Ryan about leaks, and he was, in essence, leaking that information to Ryan if he thinks he was off the record, which, Ryan, I'm on your side on this one, but...
Well, no, he was definitely not off the record, and I...
Halfway through the interview, he says, let's go off the record, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so...
There was one small part of the interview, yes, that we did not...
That you did.
But, I mean, that suggests that everything else was on.
Right, but Jake, he was leaking. He was leaking this information about Reince Priebus to you, Ryan, and complaining about leaks in the White House. Now, what does that tell you about the culture of this West Wing? So...
I don't know. It's bizarre. Senator, I also want to ask you about, just because you're friends with him, when he was in the Senate with you, Senator Sessions, a lot of Republican senators are truly emotionally upset about the public humiliation campaign that President Trump has been subjecting Attorney General Sessions to, and with some of them saying, look, just fire him or don't fire him, but don't just keep doing this. What do you think?
Jeff Sessions has a lot of support. I mean, Jeff has been a conservative warrior, someone who has great relationships, not just in the Senate, but in the entire conservative world. And I think you've seen that reflected in the pushback to the president. I've talked to several senators who have made personal calls to the president and said that this is just not going to go unnoticed, and that this is a good man. You don't treat good people like that. You don't treat the man who came out and endorsed you first, took a big risk to do that. I talked to Jeff during that time. I was out of the race by then, and he was stepping out.
It was all by himself.
He was all by himself. No other conservative was touching Donald Trump, and Jeff Sessions gave him legitimacy in the conservative community. And then to turn around and treat him as callously, that's just not going over well with me or a whole lot of other conservatives.
And Anita, I think this kind of treatment of Senator Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, hurts President Trump's agenda, because you have people like Lisa Murkowski, John McCain, Susan Collins, and others who think he's never going to do anything nice for me. Look how he treats his friends.
Well, listen, he urged the House Republicans to pass a health care bill. He lobbied them personally. He brought them down to the White House. He celebrated after they passed it. Then he went out and announced it was a mean bill. Why would any Republican go out on a limb for this president? But, Jake, something really interesting happened this week, I thought, with the Senate Republicans and with the congressional Republicans. They drew bright lines around Bob Mueller, around the Attorney General, and around the Russia sanctions bill, which passed overwhelmingly. It's like beyond veto proof. It's like, and it seems as though they're sending a very strong message this week about places they don't think this White House should try to go.
And Ryan, what are you picking up from your sources on the Hill? Are you sensing, like, we've seen some people like Chuck Grassley and Dick Shelby, conservatives who are basically Trump supporters, really getting upset? Is it a new day?
And this is just from what the public reaction of some of the senators, which you really didn't have Republican senators criticizing Trump until, in the way that they have until the Sessions attacks. And I think, look, I mean, you know, Senator Santorum, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the moment that struck me in the last week is when Trump had all 52 senators over to the White House to have a rah-rah session, let's get this bill passed. And then he leaves that meeting and goes into an interview with the New York Times and just mows down Jeff Sessions. I would think, if I'm a Republican senator leaving that White House and then opening up the Times or looking at my phone thinking, wow, I'm going to go to bat for this guy on that piece of legislation, and that's how he treats his most loyal supporter?
They're worried about leaks, but they maybe should be more worried about interviews. The things that they're saying on the record to reporters. Thanks, one and all. Appreciate you being here. Congratulations on the great interview. Really newsmaking. Thanks, Senator John McCain was that key no vote that drove Republicans' efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare into a ditch. So what's next? We'll both... Maverick turned that Republican health care bill into goose. The lead starts right now. I solemnly swear, and I mean swear, the White House in total chaos as an interview with Anthony Scaramucci turns into a David Mamet screenplay. How is this making America great again? Plus, breaking news. The North Korean threat just got even more alarming. Another missile landing dangerously close to a U.S. ally. What does this say about Kim Jong-un's nuclear program, and how will President Trump respond? Plus, thumbs down. Senator John McCain casting one of the votes that sinks the GOP effort to get rid of Obamacare. Now, will anyone step up to try to fix it? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We're going to begin with the politics lead. It is unclear if the new White House Communications Director, Anthony Scaramucci, has ever heard George Carlin's 7 words you cannot say on TV, because in just 7 days since walking into the White House, he has already knocked out at least 3 of the 7, complicating our efforts to share with you the big breaking news from the White House today. But we'll proceed. In an interview with The New Yorker, Mr. Scaramucci went after fellow White House senior officials with a tapestry of profanity that, as far as we know, is still hanging in space over the Potomac. Scaramucci, after threatening to fire the entire White House communications staff, then did an impression of Chief of Staff Reince Priebus leaking about a dinner Scaramucci was having, saying, quote, let me leak the bleeping thing and see if I can bleep block these people the way I bleep blocked Scaramucci for 6 months. Then he went on to say, Reince is a bleeping paranoid schizophrenic, a paranoiac. Of course, it might not actually be paranoia if they are really out to get you. Scaramucci went on to slam the president's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, saying, quote, I'm not Steve Bannon. I'm not trying to suck my own bleep. I'm not trying to build my own brand off the bleeping strength of the president. I'm here to serve the country. Vicious assessments of the president's chief strategist and chief of staff from the new White House communications director. Great for late night comics, but is it a positive for anyone else? This infighting does not seem to help President Trump's agenda. Quite the contrary. Republican senators offended and troubled by the president's attacks on his own attorney general seem to suggest that this predilection for chaos and insults has hurt President Trump's agenda, to say nothing of the president's ability or that of his chief of staff to be able to twist arms on Capitol Hill. Witness the spectacular failure of the Republican health care legislation early this morning. This chaos undermines public confidence in the ability of President Trump to respond to any serious threat to the nation, coming as it does amidst news of Kim Jong-un in North Korea flexing his muscle with another missile test today, to say nothing of Iran or Russia or Venezuela. None of all of this madness does anything to make America bleeping great again. As we speak, President Trump is returning to Washington, but he has not said a public word about the drama mounting among his White House staff. CNN Jeff Zeleny filed this report looking into how this is all unfolding in public and, more importantly, behind closed doors.
With new dysfunction in the West Wing and another defeat on Capitol Hill, President Trump making a quick trip to New York today.
They should have approved health care last night, but you can't have everything. Boy, oh boy. They've been working on that one for 7 years. Can you believe that? The swamp.
Speaking to law enforcement officials, the president vowing to crack down on gang violence. But it's the open warfare in the White House that's causing turmoil for his administration and the Republican agenda in Washington. The new White House communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, and the embattled chief of staff, Reince Priebus, embroiled in an extraordinarily public feud. Today, the two men shared a 48-minute flight aboard Air Force One, the day after Scaramucci's vulgar tirade against Priebus and chief strategist Steve Bannon appeared in the New Yorker magazine. The dueling aides separated by different cabins and a different view for how to lead the White House.
Thank you.
After only a week on the job, Scaramucci called Priebus a paranoid schizophrenic in an expletive-laced rant. He stopped well short of apologizing, writing on Twitter, "I sometimes use colorful language. I will refrain in this arena, but not give up the passionate fight for Donald Trump's agenda." CNN has learned there is a growing sense around the president conditions are ripening for Priebus to leave his post. His children and other advisors are urging him to find a new chief of staff. But people close to Priebus tell CNN he plans to stay put until asked to leave. He isn't going anywhere, one ally said. Two other advisors believed to be in the running for chief of staff were front and center today. Dina Powell, a deputy national security advisor, riding along with the president, and General John Kelly, Homeland Security Secretary, receiving this praise.
John Kelly is one of our great stars.
The White House infighting, depicted like this on the New York Post, comes as the president's agenda is in peril. The Republican promise to repeal Obamacare collapsed overnight in the Senate. It happened at this moment, around 1:30 in the morning, when Senator John McCain walked to the front of the chamber to cast his vote against the bill. His opposition, along with Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, extinguished, for now at least, the 7-year Republican quest to repeal President Obama's Affordable Care Act.
I said from the beginning, let Obamacare implode and then do it. I turned out to be right.
Well, Jake, he may have turned out to be right, but that does little to jumpstart the stalled Republican agenda. The White House hopes to move on to tax reform after health care, but so many Republicans on Capitol Hill are wondering if there'll be leadership from the White House to actually do that. Tax reform, of course, was once hinging on a health care bill. Now that seems like it's unlikely to happen. Jake.
And Jeff, as this public feud between aides plays out today, the president traveled to Long Island, I believe, to tout the administration's crackdown on the MS-13 street gang.
He did indeed. He was giving a speech to law enforcement officials on Long Island, talking specifically about the MS-13 gangs. He also had this very interesting message for the police. Let's watch.
When you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
So with that interesting message, Jake, wraps an interesting week here at the White House. The president will be back here shortly, spending the weekend here. We'll see what infighting and internal disputes play out over the weekend. Jake.
All right, Jeff Zeleny at the White House for us. Thank you so much. Can President Trump succeed with all this infighting among his staff? We'll ask one man who knows what it's like to be a president's chief of staff or senior advisor. David Axelrod will join me next. Stay with me.
We have Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski explaining her no vote on her party's bill to replace Obamacare. It reads in part, quote, "I voted no on health care last night because both sides must do better on process and substance. The Affordable Care Act remains a flawed law that I am committed to reforming with a structure that works better for all Americans." In case you missed the memo here, this was supposed to be American Heroes Week at the White House, but instead we saw White House cursing, White House infighting, presidential attacks on the Attorney General, and even a wild presidential speech to the Boy Scouts. The week that was. Watch.
Who the hell wants to speak about politics when I'm in front of the Boy Scouts?
Let me be very clear. I did not collude with Russia.
A scout is trustworthy, loyal. We could use some more loyalty.
You've seen the president's criticism of you. Do you think it's fair?
Well, it's kind of hurtful.
If Reince wants to explain that he's not a leaker, let him do that. But let me tell you something about myself. I am a straight shooter.
With the exception of the late, great Abraham Lincoln, I can be more presidential than any president that's ever held this office.
Breaking overnight, the thumb heard around the world.
Senator John McCain gave this skinny repeal the thumbs down.
So now, Mr. President, it's time to move on.
And that was just this week. Gloria Borges with me from Washington in the thick of things, our chief political analyst here. And Gloria, my goodness, where to begin? How about just looking at the week that was, and do you foresee, as a result of all of the above, a major shakeup coming?
Look, the way things are progressing are kind of unsustainable, I would have to say to you. And I think the President of the United States has to make some decisions. He's got open warfare among his top staffers in the White House. And you had Anthony Scaramucci, as you know, openly speaking to Ryan Lizza, saying some pretty awful things, very awful things about the White House Chief of Staff. And the question is, was he channeling Trump himself? Scaramucci seems emboldened. Reince Priebus has not been supported by people inside this White House. And so I think some decisions have to be made by the President of the United States about the operation of his White House and how that impacts his agenda. You've got the Sessions problem swirling out there. You've got the special counsel investigation. You've got a legislative agenda that is stalled. You have a president that announced transgender policy that was not cleared by the military. You have bullying that went on of Senator Murkowski that did not work. So, there are a lot of issues here, and I think somebody needs to take stock about what's going on and how to try and right the ship.
So much attention has been paid to the new guy, and of course with the Lizzo piece in the New Yorker, much ado about Scaramucci. But I just want to know more about Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, and what's his next move? I mean, is he just sort of head down, keep fighting the good fight, or what?
Well, it depends who you talk to, quite honestly. I've done some reporting along with my colleagues who cover the White House, and it really does depend on who you talk to. Some people say, look, he's been looking for an elegant way to leave for a while, and one hasn't appeared. Others are saying the president is ready to say goodbye. Others are saying that Scaramucci's bad behavior this week gives Reince a new lease on life. So it really depends on which faction you're talking to. And again, the only person who really actually knows what is going to occur is the president, because he's the one who has to make the decisions here about personnel inside this White House. And I am sure the president himself, while to blame for many of these problems, does not believe that this is smooth sailing inside the White House.
Let me share with you this quote from Sally Yates. This is an op-ed that was in today's New York Times. Former acting attorney general issued this new warning. Let me quote her. "The president is attempting to dismantle the rule of law, destroy the time-honored independence of the Justice Department, and undermine the career men and women who are devoted to seeking justice day in and day out, regardless of which political party is in power. If we are not careful, when we wake up from the Trump presidency, our justice system may be broken beyond recognition." Now, again, check the source. This is a woman who the president fired.
Yes.
So obviously she's critical. But we've also seen a number of Republican lawmakers this week openly critical. It was Lindsey Graham saying the bit about there will be holy hell, you know, if Sessions is fired in that White House. Is this a trend of more and more people, both left, right, and center, standing up to the White House?
I do. I think the Sessions issue has inspired sort of bipartisan messages to the president that you can't do this. You can't fire Jeff Sessions, whose job it is to be independent. And you have Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying, Mr. President, if you fire Sessions, we don't have time to schedule a hearing on his replacement. How about that one? So there, you know, Republicans who, by the way, like Jeff Sessions because he is conservative, and there are Democrats who don't like Jeff Sessions but believe in the independence of the Justice Department, who say, this is a non-starter, Mr. President. Be careful. Think about this, because it will have repercussions for you.
Gloria, thank you as always.
Sure.
Thank you. Today, after Congress passed a new sanctions bill against Moscow, a bill that is right now sitting on the president's desk. Vladimir Putin taking control of several U.S. diplomatic properties and ordering many U.S. diplomats and staff out of the country. But here's the question. Will President Trump sign this bill that cracks down on Russia for meddling in last year's election? The White House has been reluctant, saying it'll hurt the president's chances to cooperate with Russia. Ben Judah, author of Fragile Empire, How Russia Fell in and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin, is back with us today. Ben Judah, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Let me just begin with the retaliation. Can you explain the significance of these moves, these sudden moves by the Kremlin?
The Kremlin's classic playbook is mirroring retaliation. Any sanctions that the United States puts on Russia, it wants to be able to mirror them, to show that it too is a superpower that can bite at what matters to the United States. The problem for Russia is that whilst Russian money and Russian kleptocrats and Russian banks have lots of reasons and lots of interest in the United States, there isn't so much that the US has in Russia that makes it vulnerable to leverage. So what Putin has done is try and hit on US diplomats and US diplomatic services here. Is it comparable to the effects of these sanctions hitting banks, these sanctions hitting really the funding networks of Russian kleptocrats? Not really.
But if the president goes on and signs this bill, how will Vladimir Putin react to that?
What it will mean if the president goes on to sign this bill is that hopes of a reset, hopes of a deal between Trump and Putin are dead. Because the core of this has always been Putin trying to lift sanctions. Why is Putin so desperate to lift sanctions? That's because Russia is a kleptocracy. It's a partnership between Putin and corrupt, plundering officials and oligarchs that take their money out of Russia and put it abroad, put it in banks that launder it through the West. And what these sanctions have done is limit and freeze a lot of their financial flows. So he's desperate to lift them because it harms his partnership with the people around him. Now, this bill, if passed, cements those sanctions. And it means that what Russia's meddling would have given it over the last election cycle in the US is really very little. And it will be fitting in with what I see as a historical pattern of Russian overextension, of overplaying its hand that we see in the 19th century and we see in actions that precipitated the Cold War.
Well, it's a piece of legislation that is waiting for the president's autograph that had so much support within Congress, it is veto-proof. Ben Judah we'll see what the fallout is either way. Thank you so much. We'll see you again. Coming up next, if your head isn't entirely spinning from this crazy week in Washington, you have not been paying close enough attention. We'll discuss where the Trump administration goes from here.
I got the facts. My doctor.
Watching CNN to the continuing chaos within the White House. To be a fly on the wall during the flight the president just took to Long Island here in New York, because on this very plane was Anthony Scaramucci, the White House communications director, and the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, as this whole rivalry has taken a new ugly turn. The New Yorker. If you have not read this, start reading it now. Just released this vulgarity-laced interview Scaramucci gave to his correspondent Ryan Lizza. Scaramucci called Priebus a paranoid schizophrenic and used R-rated insults against chief strategist Steve Bannon. The mooch, as he refers to himself, later tweeted this, quote, "I sometimes use colorful language. I will refrain in this arena, but not give up the passionate fight for Donald Trump's agenda." Sarah Murray is at the White House for us today. Sarah, any word on the flight and how these two managed that?
Oh, Brooke, wouldn't you have loved to be on the plane with the two of them? This is not the large Air Force One. This is the smaller Air Force One. So, you know, not that many places to escape from one another. We have not heard exactly how that flight went. They did not seem to want to comment, apparently, as they deplaned when they were arriving in New York. But look, I think it's so striking that you have had this public feud. You've had Anthony Scaramucci say these horrific things about the chief of staff and the chief strategist. What we have not heard is President Trump come to the defense of his chief of staff. Now, of course, a lot of tongues have been wagging over these last couple of days, and there have always been rumors that Reince Priebus could soon be out the door here at the White House. And those rumors are starting once again, wondering what is the fate of a chief of staff if he's, you know, allowing someone like the White House communications director to say these things about him. No defense from the president. Now, allies to Priebus insist he's not stepping down, he's not resigning, he's staying here. His position is safe. They point to the fact that he accompanied the president to New York as an indication of that. But it just sort of gives you a sense of how dysfunction continues to reign in this White House. And it's not like this is happening while the president's priorities are being executed upon side by side. We saw this health care bill go down in a week when there has been kind of epic backbiting here in the West Wing. And it sort of makes you wonder how long all of this can continue with all of these gentlemen working together under the same roof. Brooke?
No comment on the smaller plane, and certainly that also means no public apology either. Sarah Murray, I know you're watching for it. Thank you so much at the White House. And, you know, listen, if this is like the Game of Thrones over there, we'll talk live with the former deputy chief of staff at the White House and a campaign chief who can explain why the leaks here will not stop. Conflict seems to be consuming the Trump White House. Not only is the new White House communications director picking a fight with the president's chief of staff, as this photo from the Wall Street Journal seems to perfectly sum up their chilly relationship, but the list of White House officials at odds with the president himself is growing. The Trump feuds now include, we have photos for you, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, his Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, his acting FBI Director, Andy McCabe, and his Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus. Oh, and his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. With me now, Alex Conant, a former spokesman for the Republican National Committee in the White House and the former communications director for Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, and Hinson Moore, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff for George H.W. Bush and was a former Louisiana congressman. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Alex, to you first. And I know you wrote all about leaks, but I just have to ask, just talking to Sarah Murray over at the White House on all things Scaramucci, and better not to comment. Do you think this is a guy who's going to apologize?
I mean, obviously he should apologize. Look, I don't understand how he can get on an airplane with Reince Priebus, let alone look him in the eye after those comments were printed, and he hasn't apologized for them. To me, that I don't know how you move forward without acknowledging that those comments were totally inappropriate and that the chief of staff is owed an apology. I mean, obviously there are much deeper issues at play here, but just as a man, I would think that he'd want to apologize to Reince Priebus for it.
Mr. Moore, you served as Deputy Chief of Staff under Bush 41, and by now we're familiar with this colorful language that Scaramucci used in this New Yorker interview. Maybe we've never seen a communications director use this kind of language publicly, but it's my understanding you say every White House has tensions like this.
Yeah, there's really no news in the fact that you have people unhappy in the White House, and some that even go so far as to leak information from the White House. It's not good. It ought to be controlled. It undermines the ability of a president to get his job done. But it happens. And what people on the White House staff tend to forget is they're not there because they're the smartest people in the world. They're there to help a president. And they should be thinking about the president and what's good for the president every day. And when they start leaking or they start squabbles within the White House, they're obviously following an agenda other than that, in my opinion.
Hopefully they're pretty smart, too, if this is the White House. But we know in this interview with Scaramucci, Alex, he said it was the leaks coming out of the White House and the intel community that really irked him the most. And he says, maybe I'll just fire them all. He's working hard to end the leaks. But, in a sense, you want to say, welcome to Washington, sir. I mean, is that even a possibility?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece in Politico today, actually, about this very issue. He can't just fire everybody and expect the leaks will stop. Because, look, all political organizations leak to a certain degree. The ones that leak the most do so because they lack unity, they lack loyalty, and they lack less self-discipline. And clearly this White House lacks all three of them. And frankly, it's because of the president's own behavior. He has not given his White House team a unifying principle beyond just defending his own reputation. He clearly doesn't inspire loyalty in people because loyalty is a two-way street. When the way he's treated Reince Priebus and his attorney general does not instill loyalty in others. And finally, it's no secret that the president himself often has off-the-record conversations with reporters where he says more than he should. If the president himself is leaking to reporters as he does, then it's hard to expect his staff not to follow his example.
Let's just, let's get some perspective of previous White Houses and how this worked. I mean, Hinton, it's my understanding you have some pretty great stories on how, President Bush and how he dealt with leaks within his own White House. How did Bush Sr. keep this under wraps?
Well, basically, the first thing is the staff has to realize they're not serving the president well. Secondly, my experience was to see a very strong chief of staff. And I'm not commenting on the current one. I'm simply saying the one I saw work internally in Jim Baker. He had the complete support of the president. He and the president were very close friends. Therefore, President Bush could turn over the total running of the White House to Jim Baker. Jim Baker, in turn, very carefully controlled the staff. You only knew what you needed to know to get your job done. There were just a handful, a small group of people around Jim Baker that knew everything that was going on. Therefore, if there was any kind of leak or any kind of trouble, Jim Baker knew exactly where it came from. Consequently, there wasn't any. He actually brought order and he brought discipline to a White House that needed it at a time in 1992 when things were pretty tough for President Bush. I think that Donald Trump, the President Trump's in the same place now. He's having a hard time getting his administration running smoothly, partly because this is new to him. It seems to be new to a lot of the people around him in the White House. And some discipline needs to be brought. And it needs to be run differently.
What would that be? If I may just jump in, what advice? What would that discipline look like? What advice would you have for this current White House?
Well, I think that President Trump needs to sit down and figure out who's really close to him. And he's got to give them, that person, the power to really run the White House. And then he needs to also agree that only a few people need to be brought in on everything. And therefore, you limit the amount of people involved in something, and you therefore limit the ability for any kind of meaningful leak to the press. And that's one way you get it done, and that's the way I saw it done.
Mr. President, are you watching? Are you watching? Yeah. Alex, quickly, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I largely agree with what he just said. You need to have one person who's in charge. You can't have a communications director who reports directly to the president and a chief of staff. You need to have clear chains of command. Otherwise, you're going to have all sorts of factions forming, and they're going to leak against each other, as we've seen, and the infighting will continue.
Alex Conant and Hinton Moore, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
President Trump facing a huge decision about whether to sign a new Russia sanctions bill. But as he decides, Russia today is retaliating. Hear what Vladimir Putin did to the U.S. diplomats and properties.
CNN breaking news.
We continue on. You're watching CNN on this Friday afternoon. I'm Brooke Baldwin. We have more now on the stunning defeat of the Republicans' effort to repeal Obamacare. Moments ago, President Trump going off script, sounding off against Congress.
They should have approved health care last night, but you can't have everything. Boy, oh boy. They've been working on that one for 7 years. Can you believe that? The swamp. But we'll get it done. We're going to get it done. You know, I said from the beginning, let Obamacare implode and then do it. I turned out to be right. Let Obamacare implode.
Let Obamacare implode, he says. In the end, it was just 19 seconds that dashed those 7 years of hope. After debating into the wee hours of the morning, it was Senator John McCain right there who shocked a lot of his colleagues on the Republican side, casting the third no vote, giving the dramatic thumbs down on the Senate floor. There you go. Joining me more to talk about this and what happens next for health care in this country, Jake Tapper, host of State of the Union and The Lead. Jake Tapper, what do you make of the president, first off, just there in Long Island, you know, saying let Obamacare implode?
Well, I mean, as a policy, it's not really optimal. I mean, Obamacare is failing in several parts of the country, with premiums going up, with very few options, with health insurance plans withdrawing from the exchanges. And the idea of letting it implode means millions of Americans continuing to have skyrocketing premiums or have very few, if any, options when it comes to health care. It means let Americans suffer. So it's not really a policy prescription in any sense.
On health care, we just played the moment, the thumbs down with Senator McCain. I mean, there's so many storylines. You know, President Obama's former opponent saving Obama's signature piece of legislation, or coming back from cancer diagnosis to cast this deciding vote, or the senator who hasn't seen eye to eye with President Trump delivering a major blow to his agenda 2 years and a week from, you know, Donald Trump saying he wasn't a hero. You know, whatever it is, did it seem that Senator McCain took one for the team, defending other senators who've been vulnerable for voting yes? How do you see that?
From talking to people around McCain, it really comes down to the idea of his lack of confidence in the process and the fact that there was this possibility out there that so-called skinny repeal, which was ultimately what the Republicans were voting for, except for 3 of them, and the Democrats were voting against. Skinny repeal, that's banning any federal dollars going to Planned Parenthood, the repeal of the individual mandate, the repeal of the employer mandate, and also the removal of the medical device tax. The fear that would actually become the health care law. That was what McCain was concerned about. Obviously, we